views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Derek Chauvin was found guilty on all counts in the murder of George Floyd. Is this the justice that Black America has been asking for? Was the guilty verdict due to the evidence or just a sign of the times? Well, we've seen several recent police-involved deaths of unarmed Black people since George Floyd's death. So the question is, where do we go from here? Coming up on this edition of Perspectives, we go front and center evaluating those questions and a whole lot more. I'm Daren Jaime, and you're watching Perspectives.
What's on your mind? Express what's on your mind. What's on your mind?
Anything relevant to life, you bring it to the table. Whether you make a move solo or a movement with a stable. No fables, you speak on your decisions. Cause in the long run, it's your voice, your views, your vision. Keeping it real with many messages for you to know. This ain't radio, but DJ runs the show. Entertainment, he rocks it. Politics, he locks it. The host with the most would handle any topic. Don't forget to share your perspective with shines of light. Cause it might make a difference in someone else's life.
Make a difference in someone's life. Express what's in your heart and your mind. Share your perspective.
What's your perspective? Let them know.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Perspectives. I am Daren Jaime, and of course, we thank you for joining us. You can watch Perspectives every week here on BronxNet's Channel 67. Now, listen, if you want to catch us on the web, that's anytime at bronxnet.org. And then we also invite you to stay connected to us via social media. How do you do that? Well, we've got Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and if you want to reach me personally, my professional page is Daren C. Jaime on Facebook, and then on Twitter and Instagram, DC Jaime 23. And of course, you'll get some information. You quite possibly might also receive some inspiration as well. So go check it out. All righty. Well, we want to talk about today's show, the conviction of ex-Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, charged with second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter in the killing of George Floyd on May 25th in South Minneapolis. Our guest today, well, about a year ago, she joined us after the videos of George Floyd was seen pinned down under former police officer Derek Chauvin's knee for more than 9 minutes on May 25th, 2020. We've got Dr. Juhanna Rogers here with us. She's a critical race scholar who spent years exploring the intersections of race in America. She is a strong voice and activist who continues to build platforms to have critical conversations on race, justice, and equity. Dr. Rogers utilizes her national and international experience to motivate and educate Black and Brown leaders in order to create change in their communities as well as their professional spaces. And Dr. Rogers, good to have you back here with us here on Perspectives.
Thank you. Thank you, Darren, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Glad to have you back. And so listen, when we talk about it, like a year ago, you were here and I was yourself and Mark Claxton. You had an opportunity to see the video of George Floyd being murdered by, now we know, to be murdered by Derek Chauvin. We knew it then. We just needed court to do its job. Give me your emotions, given the fact that almost a year later and you receive conviction on all 3 counts.
My goodness. I can't believe that. First, that was a year ago. That just blows my mind. Because for many, it seems like yesterday, but this is continuing to happen seems like every day in different parts of the country, the city, and all of that. And so last Tuesday when the verdict came down, myself and colleagues watched the verdict be handed out via Zoom together as a community. And when I say there was a sense of a weight being lifted, when it came to me personally, I felt that for a minute, but then I also still felt this deep sadness because I know that there's more work to be done. And that only came to light, right, as the days followed with that conviction, yet we saw the killings of additional individuals of color, Black folks specifically, that were unarmed yet again, just the day after and the day after that, a couple of days before. And so while we felt like we got one, win doesn't seem like the appropriate term to use, but we got one acknowledgement that there's something going on and there's something wrong. The days to follow only just reminded us that there's more work to be done. So I'm glad you have me back to have this conversation and just really dissect what's happening here, because there's a flaw somewhere, right? And I'm not really sure. I haven't done much work with police departments or other fire departments or anything like that yet, but I'm asking some questions around what that training looks like. What kind of conversations are happening in the academy? What kind of screening processes are happening to understand just psychologically where people are, what their ideas on race tend to be before they put the uniform on, right? Because there's a disconnect somewhere.
There is this huge disconnect, and sometimes that disconnect can be found in the cultural competency, right? And that's just simply you have people who don't live in the community, policing a community, and coming in and making determinations, or not understanding the value of relationship, right? In this case, Derek Chauvin knew George Floyd. That was a relationship that went bad. But when you have good police officers who are doing their job, what you find is the benefit of relationship. And so for every Derek Chauvin, I'm grateful that I see officers out on the court playing basketball, right? And they're playing basketball with kids, they're giving kids, Steph Curry sneakers. You got other ones who are helping people, across across the street and doing all these great things. But unfortunately, we have to spend time really dealing with the fact that these people who are the rogue ones, and let's be honest, in most of the cases are the minority, do get away with literally murder. And so I'll ask you this question. I heard this said before, and I think it's a good question to ask. Do you feel like this was justice or accountability?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it was accountability. I think we got a long way to go, right? Because justice would ensue that systematically this outcome will be yielded in other similar circumstances. This is the first time, right, in Minneapolis history, with other departments, we haven't seen these outcomes. And so I think for me, calling this justice would mean that systematically we're going to see more outcomes that look like this when it's deemed necessary, right? When the evidence points to such, that this is happening and that the questions are being asked, and we're seeing some of the policies that are in place being reviewed and shifting, right? That's when I would feel most comfortable feeling like there's justice versus this time there's a form of accountability for one specific incident. My son turned 16 years old yesterday and he got his permit, right? And and I went down to see him, and it was just this the sentiment of me wanting to ensure that there was some aspect of usefulness, enjoyment for him, because putting him behind the wheels of a car, for any parent putting your kid behind the wheel of a car for the first time, there's a sign of growing up. But for me, as a mother of a Black young man, that could be, in many ways, not to be dramatic, but a death sentence.
Right.
And
what's bad is you have to have a conversation. I think about the conversation I had with my son, right? Because when you're that age and you're going to be driving a car, and if you're driving my vehicle, there is a chance that you maybe stop, right? And you have to have these conversations. But the problem that I have is that the conversations that I have to have, other people don't always recognize. So, my Caucasian colleagues don't understand what it means when I say, hey, I have to have a conversation with my son about being Black in America and then being Black and behind the steering wheel. Now that people see it on video, the light is starting to go on the part of some people. But yet and still, on the other hand, you've got others who say, listen, you know what? It's not really an issue. But the reality is that for all of us, we deal with this on a daily, on a daily basis. Talk to us about just us as a community and communities of color. What do you think watching a George Floyd's brother be exuberant, watching a Ben Crump and Al Sharpton and those at that press conference after, somebody said it was like a family reunion, but the truth of the matter was there was a whole lot more emotionally that was attached to the moment that I think the average person kind of got a chance to understand. So can you unpack that a little bit for me?
Yeah, in that moment, and like I said, I was watching via Zoom, and with my colleagues from work, but at one point I just had to come off camera, right? Because this made me think back to Emmett Till, right? This made me think back to all of the Black young men and women that were murdered, right, throughout history, that there was no justice for their cases. There was no form of accountability. And for us, this felt like a moment, like I said, not a win, but a sense of relief, a sense that finally someone is recognizing a group of individuals, a jury of our peers. The Black Panther Party wrote about that in 1966. Like, we need to have a jury of our peers. That means reflective of our communities when we have individuals that are brought up on crimes against people of color or that happen within communities that are largely populated by folks of color. And I think what we see here is that the things that we've been asking for generations upon generations upon generations played out in one specific instance. Now, for me, the burden, the moment after that sigh of relief was like, will this happen again? Is there going to be justice for Andrew Brown? Is someone going to take up the other officers that pulled the other military brother over and maced him? I'm forgetting his name at the time. The young brother that got killed in Chicago, the next day or so. It's just like, what happens next, right? And this one instance doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to have a different conversation with my now 16-year-old, right? The conversation's going to persist. And that's a heavy load. That's generations, years of burden, right? And grief we've been carrying around, right? That impact of racial battle fatigue, right, becomes really real and realized. Because in the moments after the interviews and such, for me, it wasn't, I wasn't cheering, right? This is a pretty solemn situation any way you flipped it. Somebody lost their life since, and it didn't need to be that, right? And so what will happen next? What does this mean as far as reform? Who are going to be the folks at the table, right? I don't know who's in charge of these cultural competency trainings for police departments, but let's have a conversation about what that curriculum looks like, what the process looks like for us to begin to have those community dialogues, and how can we bring the officers that are doing their thing out there, keeping our community safe, understanding the nuances of the job and doing the thing, because like you said, there are a lot more of them than maybe not. But the question is, how do we do enough to combat, the last 200 years or 300 years of injustices and the lack of protection we have received as folks of color?
Let me take a quick break and come back and talk more with you, Dr. Juhanna Rogers, our guest here on Perspectives. We're talking about reaction to the Derek Chauvin verdict and where do we go from here. You're watching Perspectives with yours truly, Daren Jaime. We'll be back in a few. We're back here on Perspectives, continuing our conversation with Dr. Juhanna Rogers, who is definitely a critical race scholar and one who is very fluent in this area when we talk about racism and really culture, America. Where do we go from here, Black America? And we're glad to have her being back on the show. Last time she was here, it was really right after George Floyd was murdered. We saw the video and we had an opportunity to her and also Detective Mark Claxton, and we give him a special shout out to he's been working the field in CNN and MSNBC and all that, and I told him as soon as he gets finished with the big dogs, come on, hang out with the little brother over here, and he's gonna make sure he comes out and hangs out with us. So shout out to Mark Claxton for the work that he's doing, representing literally both sides in a dignified manner. But Dr. J, I'll bring it to you like this. I wrote in a recent opinion piece that putting a knee on the neck is just one way to choke the life out of somebody. Poverty chokes the life out of somebody. Absolutely. Racism chokes the life out of somebody. Unemployment can choke the life out of somebody. And we have these other ways that life is actually being choked out in communities of color. When we talk about moving from here, it's not just a conversation about police, right? We're talking about a broader conversation that deals with race, that deals with equality, and it deals with equity. For the ally or the person that wants to be the ally to communities of color, what should they know now?
Allies. It's time for you to listen, right? It's about, I talk with people about listening, and oftentimes, depending on where you are in your allyship journey, right? Because I think right now we're in a very empathetic moment where folks are coming to light and they're seeing some things differently, right? And I often challenge my allies, right? This isn't time for you to know the answers, right? Because clearly, if you recognize where you are in your allyship, right, there's an understanding. If you're a white ally, then understand what that whiteness means and what it represents, and what terms like white privilege, and understanding the emotions of white fragility and unpacking that. That's a lot of personal work to do, right? But where I think we are, if you are on that journey, if you are taking that path, then it's to say, okay, what haven't I been hearing? Oftentimes, in these situations, historically, it's like we've been telling people for generations what we need. The system is working, not in fact broken. The outcomes of who's attending certain colleges, we're determining in the third grade. So let's look back at what our education systems in areas where there are large populations of folks of color. Let's look at what that third grade system or experience looks like and fix it, because we know that's a huge indicator in where someone is going, and how the future of our young people are determined, right? We know those things, right? I need my allies now to acknowledge that we've been saying this for generations, and it's that access and that privilege and that those positions that they sit in, asking them, how are you now going to leverage them to create shifts, right? How are we going to shift our lenses? How are you going to, now that as an ally, how are you seeing the world differently? Not just empathizing with us because we are emotionally responding to the traumatic experiences that we've been experiencing since 1619, right? But what are you, in fact, going to do about it?
So right. Here's my next Facebook post is coming up real quick, and it's talking about, listen, I mean, for real, it's a conversation, but this is the question I have for allies. Are you empathetic or are you authentic? Because there has to be, I have to ask the question, because everybody empathetic is not authentic, right? Right. Not authentic in listening, because an authentic person who's empathetic really wants to do something about it, right? Or really wants to become more engaged and more involved. An empathetic person is not just about just listening to, that's the first step, but it's also, what can I do with my privilege or the benefit of my privilege in order to make life better for everyone? Right. Unfortunately, there are people who want to be empathetic but don't want to be authentic to the place where they're going to do something with that empathy. Absolutely not. And I think part of what we have to do,
right? Did this work? You asked the question, was this accountability or injustice or a sense of justice being served? And I choose the term accountability because I think the pressure is on the system. The pressure is there. We're pushing, and we're showing up. And I think it's a number of factors and dynamics that are happening, right? And part of that is us being sheltered in our homes. You know, there's a lot happening in this moment. The future is looking different. There's a lot of things in question, and part of that has contributed to people seeing what's been happening systematically to folks of color for a long time, and we're putting pressure on that system. And I think we got to keep applying it.
Yeah. Let me take a quick break and come back with more with Dr. Juhanna Rogers. We'll get to our final segment coming up right after this. And we're back here on Perspectives. Daren Jaime here with you. We are glad to be continuing our conversation here with Dr. Juhanna Rogers, who's been talking about reaction and where do we go from here following the conviction of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Dr. J, let me bring you to this place. We talk a lot about in our community about the fact that one of the driving forces was all of America and beyond really took to the streets in a form of protest, Black Lives Matter, the whole 9 yards, when it came to George Floyd in a really, really, really profound way. But I want you to balance this out for me here, because in order for real activism and action, and in this case, conviction to occur, you have to have a couple of things. You have to have advocacy, and then you also have to have strategy. And on this case, George Floyd, the advocacy leveled up, and so did the strategy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so many, it'll be interesting this moment in history, 30 years from now when folks are writing about it, right? We're in the thick of it. And so our perspective, right, is limited, right? But for me, someone who's looked at Black history extensively, when I look to see what happened in response to the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Mr. Avery down in Georgia last year, and I looked at how we're organizing, right? And I would be remiss to say that this isn't reminiscent of what happened in the 50s, right? When churches began to convene. I think the power of technology and the way that we've connected, right, communities across the world, right, is playing a huge part in our ability to keep the pressure on the system, right? We've figured out, right, that what is happening to us is not necessarily as invisible as it was. It's not as easy to turn your eye away from it, right? It's as they say on Twitter, right? It's trending, right? Hence why I believe, we're hearing every day about another incident. I don't think this is unique to COVID. I think this had been happening, right? But now media, political action groups, they're talking about it. They're putting the videos out there. They're showing, like, the young brother that got accosted down in Columbia, South Carolina, when he was walking through the neighborhood, right? Like, more instances are showing up like that. And as you can see, folks are turning out on those scenes to say, try it again, right? And so I think it's the technology, right? The connectivity, because now American society has slowed down, right? We're catching up with one another. We're talking to one another, being more intentional about relationships. We're seeing what's happening across communities, and it's giving us a foundation to talk about the system in a way that we hadn't before, because if something happened in Minneapolis, well, then it happened in Minneapolis. We weren't trending about how that connects to the case that happened in Chicago or Columbus or Virginia or down in North Carolina. And I think us being in our homes, unfortunately, as a result of COVID, what has come out of it is a more succinct conversation about the injustices, right, happening to Black and Brown communities.
And when we talk about this, we got a couple minutes left before we wrap up. But I think that one of the things that we have to continue to put at the forefront is, I say justice. When we talk about accountability and justice, yeah, it is accountability, but it's also justice, right? Because what happens is the criminal justice system worked. And for once, the criminal justice system worked, and it favored Blacks, and it favored us in such a way. The justice system was set up to work. But the problem is, who's carrying out the justice? And so for me, I feel like, yeah, it was justice, but it was justice that was brought about by accountability. And it's the accountability that actually led to justice actually being served. But I'll give you the final, I'll give you your final thoughts. Yeah.
I will agree with you to that extent. It happened because a system became inclusive. That jury box, right, didn't look like the stereotypical jury boxes that we've seen in the past when it comes to these cases. And that plays a huge part to my point about the Black Panther Party. When we really build a sense of inclusion within our system, and when I say system, I mean broadly across this country, when we have more diverse leadership at corporate tables, when we have more diversity on the benches, when we have more diversity in the jury boxes, when we have more diversity in the teachers standing before our diverse population of kids, it's been founded over and over again. The outcomes tend to be more inclusive, right? Not to say they always are going to yield the same way, but it nuances, it helps us think more innovatively about the problems we have to solve. And I think that probably had a huge part to do with what happened in the case last week. And I will call it justice when we see that happening systematically for more cases. Not to say the outcomes will always be the same, but to say that there's representation, true American representation in our justice system across the board.
We definitely need systematic justice, and that is without question. Dr. Juhanna Rogers, thank you so much for being here with us and sharing with us here on Perspectives. Of course, your voice is very much needed in a time such as this, and we're glad that we can bring you on and to be able to share with us today.
Thank you for having me, always.
All righty, Dr. Juhanna Rogers, our guest here on Perspectives. I want to tell you, listen, it's important that you do, as you continue in this fight for justice, as we've been talking about, continue to do those two things. You can be a part of the advocacy, which is the people who are out there protesting, or you can be a part of the strategy, which is the people who are at the table, who have the opportunity to make a decision or to enlighten or to empower or to make a decision that can change the life and the scope of something. Yeah, there's two ways that you can get on. You can get on advocacy and get on the strategy. But don't just sit by idly and do nothing. The death of George Floyd was horrific, but what made the difference was the community actually got together and made up in their mind that enough was enough. When we make up our mind that enough is enough, not just about George Floyd, but in our everyday local communities, what a powerful change can come about. Well, that's my perspective. Listen, make sure you share yours because it just might make a difference in somebody else's life. Daren Jaime saying, take care. God bless. And we'll see you soon.
Many messages for you to know. This ain't radio, but DJ runs the show. Entertainment.